Hello, my Grotzingates, and welcome back to another episode of Happy Crumping War Gaming. Today, we've got something a little sad to talk about. There are some things that happen in this game that create lots and lots of feels bads, and we don't want to have feels bads because we absolutely adore this game. It's a fantastic game, Warhammer 40,000, and we want to keep it fantastic. We want to keep having fun and make it fair for everyone. So on this channel, what we do is we teach you how to play at a really, really high level with a variety of armies, with a variety of strategies and tactics. And today, we're going to make sure how to avoid being feels badded, I suppose you could call it. So essentially, there are a couple different types of foul play. You've got blatant cheating, which is nonsense, and it's not to be tolerated ever. But believe it or not, people cheat at silly games. I know a lot of people say that, oh, it's just a silly game, no one will ever cheat. Wrong. People will cheat at it. Abso-freaking-lutely. People will cheat in pickup games because it gives them dopamine to win. Which, by the way, I kind of understand that. I don't agree with it, but I get dopamine when I win. Don't you? Everyone feels better. Generally speaking, everyone feels better when they win. So some people will cheat when there's no stakes on the line just to win. It just will happen. However, most of the time when we get feels bads in games, it's actually not cheating. And so this video isn't talking about cheaters or anything like that. Instead, we're talking about a bunch of the non-cheating BS that happens in the game that is just, it's not okay, and it creates abusive environments that really will decrease enjoyment, and it's honestly just not fair. So we're going to talk about some things like movement laziness. We're going to be talking about rules bullying, and then we're going to learn how to deal with sloppy play that really encourages a lot of feels bads. So hop on in, get ready for it. I'm going to show you a couple very specific scenarios using TTS to kind of demonstrate what people will do, whether it's intentional or unintentional, and how to avoid these scenarios so that you and your opponents can always enjoy playing the game together, and you don't need to create feels bads. Honestly, most of the time, people are not doing these types of things in order to create these feels bads situations, but the end result is it will create a lot of feels bad situations. So we got to learn what we do, what our opponents do, and how to avoid these things. Number freaking 1, rules bullying. And this is one that really annoys me a lot, that I actually see a lot when I'm playing, say, at our local club or when I'm playing in TTS leagues. So if those of you who don't know, I host regular TTS leagues on the Discord, and we haven't had any issues in that, but some of the other TTS leagues that I've been in, I've been called into TO for people, and people are just making some outlandish claims, and they're trying to enforce their will upon their opponent and just hope their opponent goes along with it. And it's really not okay. I know for a fact that our local tournament leagues, not even just TTS, but in reality, it is a hard no in the player plaque that if you do not know 100% the answer to a certain rule, you have to call a TO. It's not even about allowing people the opportunity to just bully people in rules. So let me give you some examples of what this is. You and your opponent are playing, and that your opponent says that they have 21 OC or 22 OC on an objective, because this is actually a scenario that happened with me, right? 22 OC on an objective. And your opponent's like, oh, darn it, because I only have 21. So you out-OC me, so you're going to score it. And then what they do is they look at you and they say, hey, listen, are you sure your character has 2 OC? And your opponent will say, well, of course they have 2 OC. Absolutely. That is actually an unintentional form of rules bullying. Because what will end up happening is your opponent will be like, can you look that up for me? And you just say, oh, no, you don't trust me? What are you talking about? I don't need to look it up. Yeah, it's 2 OC. Just trust me. It's not okay. Just look it up. Find the rule. Show them to you that you actually have 2 OC. It's not that big a deal. So the way to avoid rules bullying, and I actually see this happen a lot unintentionally when we see some of the higher level players playing, because you'll see some higher level players that'll be playing and they're doing great work. They're crushing their opponents just like they typically will, and a scenario will come up that seems like a little bit weird, and the more popular player or the more experienced player will just say the rule or say how it is or teach or just say this is how the interaction works. Don't question me, and they're not doing it intentionally, but this is a form of rules bullying or an appeal to authority. When you come up to a scenario where you are not sure that this is the way the interaction works, look up the actual rule. We're playing this game for a minimum 3 hours anyway. take 2 minutes, look up the actual rule, see how it works. If you have an argument about an interaction, you call a TO and allow the TO to make a ruling on how it actually works. One thing that I really want you to be careful of when you're playing your opponents is if they do not offer up like a little preview of how their army works pre-game, that is a big red flag. And you need to make sure that you're a little bit careful about asking specifically how their army works. So I will give you an example of this, okay? You're playing Sisters of Battle for the first time, and you don't really know how Sisters of Battle play. You tell your opponent, be like, oh, I'm excited. This is the first time I've played Sisters of Battle. And your opponent says, great, let's start rolling dice. This is not cheating, but it is creating a situation where there will be some gotchas that are going to create feels bad moments. So what I would encourage you to do in this scenario is be like, hey, would you mind taking about 5 minutes and just kind of give me an overview of how your army works, what your enhancements do, what your stratagems do? Do you have any specific rules that kind of change the way the game goes? And then your opponent gets to say a few things like, oh, yeah, totally. Actually, so I've got a few stratagems that will let me resurrect characters. I have a stratagem that will force you to hit one of my units instead of the unit that you want to hit. I've got a stratagem that will allow me to shoot you after you shoot me in your phase. So just by going over a little bit of this information pre-game, you get to avoid these feels bad situations where you're playing the game and you expect normal game interactions, but your opponent actually has a rule that changes the normal interactions. When your opponent does not give you a heads up on this, this creates what we call a gotcha scenario, where it's like you're moving into 9 inches. Say you want to move up for a charge, okay? And you want to make sure that you're within 5 inches, so you have a 5-inch charge. And your opponent says, cool, go ahead and do it. And then you move and you're 5 inches away, you're ready to roll your charge, and your opponent says, okay, I'm going to activate my reactive movements. And you say, oh, I didn't know that you had a reactive movement. And your opponent at that point in time has the ability to say, sucks to suck, you should have known. At a certain level, this is okay, right? So if you're playing at like the finals of a super major and your opponent has a lieutenant with combi weapon, which is a super common unit in the game that has this ability, they know that you know they have this ability. But I would still argue it is the onus of the player. If your intention is to be moving up for a 5-inch charge and you're saying, hey, I'm going to move my guys in this position so I get a 5-inch charge, it is the onus is on the other player to be like, hey, just remember they have a reactive movement. Is that a hard rule in the game? No. But this is how we avoid gotchas. We just create open, honest communication as we're playing so that no one ever feels like they've been gotcha'd. Because once they tell you that, hey, remember I've got a reactive movement, you get to make the decision, okay, cool, I'm going to do it anyway, or, oh, I have to make a different plan. This is a very complicated game, and no one alive is going to know all of the freaking rules, so we have to work together. We have to play the game together. So you need to make sure that if your opponent is making a claim that you don't agree with, they show you the rules in print. Never accept, trust me, this is the way it works. I do this in tournaments, right? I don't mind being wrong. If my opponent and I disagree on a rule or an interaction, I don't mind being wrong. It's okay. I just say, hey, show me in print the way that works. If I was wrong, that's a fantastic thing because now I have learned. And if I was correct, that's a fantastic thing because now my opponent has learned. Or if they were trying to pull one over on me, which has happened in the past, it doesn't happen often, but it has happened in the past, then I don't get done dirty and I feel good and I don't feel bad, right? And the last thing on this rules bullying or gotchas, etc., TOs exist. Tournament organizers exist. The people who are the referees exist. Use them. I do not argue at tables. If my opponent and I have a disagreement about something works, and then we look up the rule and we read it and we're still disagreeing, I'm done. I'm done arguing. I say, cool. And I just grab a TO and I let them make the decision. At that point in time, the TO will essentially always rule correctly, and there's no fighting, there's no bad feels. There's just, hey, listen, this is what the TO said. Let's keep playing. And then you just get to enjoy a good, loving game. Now let's go on to the second thing that happens with non-cheating bullshit that happens in games. And this is the one that some people might argue I'm too much of a stickler for, but I don't care. This one is a big deal. This is one that I see a lot of people do all the time, and it really irritates me because people tend to take way too many liberties with movement, and they end up just honestly not playing the same game. It's not okay. So when you're in the movement phase or really anytime you're moving your models, you need to be very specific and careful about the way movement works, because movement is the strongest phase of the game. And if you're sloppy in it, you can really screw up your game plan, your opponent's game plan, and the game in general. I see this on stream quite often when we're watching people on live streams at like tournaments and stuff. And it just irks me to no end where people just take so many liberties that just, it's very, very horrible. Typically, you're going to see big issues with people when they are doing pile-ins or when they're doing disembarks. The rules of the game are very, very clear. When you do a pile-in, you must end your movement closer to the closest enemy model. If you're moving away from the closest enemy model, you're playing the game wrong. Now, you might not be actually cheating. You might just have not pre-measured to make sure that you're doing it correctly, which is very sloppy play, which is dishonest, and it is bullshit. So when you're doing these types of things, you need to make sure that you actually pre-measure all of your movements so that you do things correctly. It's not about being like, oh, it's so taxing that, it's just faster if I do it this way. Well, it might be faster, but it's also freaking wrong, and you're taking advantage of your opponent when you take little shortcuts. It happens all the freaking time. So I'm going to go to TTS. I'm going to kind of demonstrate how some of these work. The things that I really want to show you guys so that you don't get caught out on this and your opponents don't do it accidentally thinking they're doing it correctly when they're not doing it correctly. So the things that we really need to think about is pile-ins need to be done correctly. Disembarks need to be done correctly, because oftentimes people will say roll the advance roll before they disembark, and then they just move all their models in a line, but that actually can't work. I'm going to show you on TTS how that doesn't work. You're also going to see people do things like, I'm just going to roll all of my 8 advances, and I'll put the dice next to the units. It's going to save time, so I can just roll the advances, and I'll move all of my guys. Wrong. That's cheating. I would argue most of the time that's actually blatant cheating. Occasionally it'll happenly be unintentional BS that's not cheating. But if you roll your advances on all of your units and then you move your units, you have given yourself a massive advantage in the game by having pre-knowledge of a random dice roll. That is not okay. I've seen this on stream by some very, very high-level players who I have a lot of respect for, but they do this, and I'm like, wait a second, what? Then you have to question yourself, is this person really that good at the game if the only reason they're winning is because they're taking such liberties? And it really feels bad situations for the game that they're playing, and it also feels bad situations for the people who are watching, because a lot of times the people who are watching are trying to learn from these more experienced players. And honestly, it's not just experienced players who do this. There's many, many more inexperienced players who do stuff like this. But we need to make sure that we watch it really well. Okay, so rolling advances first, save time. No, not okay. You need to watch when you're doing measurements. When you're doing measurements, if you're saying that you're going to move your model, say 8 inches, you need to move your model as close to 8 inches as possible. Very often, you'll see people take the measuring tape and they'll measure it on out, and then you'll move the model, and then they'll just instead of putting it down where 8 is, they'll put it down like this. And they give themselves an extra 1.5 inches of movement, which in a game of 40K can be the difference between winning and losing. And honestly, oftentimes is. So you need to be as careful with movement as possible. One of the things I recommend to make sure that you get a lot better at movement is you use these measuring tools. So if you see what we've done here, some really cool cat on Etsy created one of these things. So the bottom device is 9 inches long. The middle device is going to be like a 6-inch long unit, and then the top device is going to be a 3-inch long unit. So you can use these, which is going to end up giving you a much more accurate measurement than using a tape measure a lot of times. So I really highly recommend everyone gets a tool like this. I'm currently working on trying to get some of these printed up for with Happy Crump and Wargaming patterning on them so that we can provide those to all of you. But it really does improve your movement phase, and it makes it a lot more accurate. And when things are more accurate, it feels better, and we can have more fun games because we know everything's being done as correctly as possible. Now, it's going to be truly impossible to be 100% precise on movement, and I understand that, and everyone else understands that. You're always going to be 0.1, 0.2 off. It's the nature of playing a game where you're having to kind of do a little bit of an eyeball. So you can always have a little bit of grace with your opponents, and whenever something's right on the edge, I don't know if it's 8 or 9 inches, if it's like 8.9 or 9 inches, I generally always give the benefit of the doubt to my opponent. It's just the way I play. I'm not saying you need to play that. But if I see something and we aren't certain if it's 8.9 or 9 inches, I say, cool, it's 8.9. No problem. You have an 8-inch charge. Give the benefit of the doubt. Give grace to your opponent. But this is contingent on your opponent playing a clean game. Anytime someone says, hey, I'm just speeding the game up, it's going to be better for you this way, it's a red flag. It doesn't mean it's not true, but it is an absolute red flag. And then lastly, what we need to do to make sure that these sloppy movement problems don't happen is we need to pre-measure our movements. This is a huge deal. If you're getting ready to charge an opponent, pre-measure the distance. Hey, this is an 8-inch charge. Do you agree? Your opponent says, yes, I agree. Then roll your dice. Because if you roll a 7, you can't go back and measure and be like, oh, maybe it's a 7. This happens a bunch. I see people do things like, all right, cool, let's go ahead and roll this dice, and then they see that they rolled a 7 where they think they need an 8, and they go ahead and measure, and they're like, oh, I think it's 7, I think it's good, and your opponent doesn't want to be a jerk, so they just say, okay, fine, it's 7. But it wasn't a 7, it was an 8. Pre-measure, agree with your opponent what you're doing to make sure that you're both on the same page, to make sure that no one has any feels bad. Now, I'm going to switch to the TTS view so I can kind of demonstrate a few of these things for you guys. All right, here we go. Okay, now when it comes to measuring movement, there's a pretty big issue that I see quite often. For example, here, we have a kill rig, and it wants to go through this gap. And the kill rig has a movement value of 10. So what I see people do a lot of times is they'll do something like, they will move him here, and they'll go 10 inches with him. Now, this is not okay. You see people do this very, very often, and it's like, bro, it just doesn't work that way. You have to pay for the rotation. You can't even come here, and then move him here, and then move 5 more inches. It doesn't work that way either. So one thing that you'll see is people who just don't understand movement rules in general, and they'll just move them like that, and they'll move 10 inches. That's not okay, because vehicles can't move through walls. However, another thing for vehicles is that you have to pay for rotation. So you also can't move 5 inches here, rotate them, and then move another 5 inches. This also does not work, because you have to pay for that rotation. So what you would actually have to do if you want to make this maneuver work is you're going to have to move about 5.5 inches, and then you have to rotate, and it's going to take quite a bit of rotation, because the way you have to measure is you measure from the base, and it's going to be about 3.5 inches just to rotate your base 90 degrees. So it's going to be like this. That was 5.5 plus 3.5 to get to here, roughly. So that is what? That's 9 inches. You only have 1 more inch of movement. Versus what we see people do a lot of times where they'll just come out here, they'll move their 5 inches, then they'll rotate, and then they'll try to go 5 inches. You're getting a lot of free movement when you do that, and it's not necessarily cheating, it's people not understanding the rules of the game, or it's people just moving quickly and being sloppy. So what you really have to make sure you do is you make sure that you pay for all of your movement, you pay for all of your rotations, especially on things like vehicles. So if we were to move 5 inches here, you're going to pay for your 3.5 inches of rotation. That's got to be a little bit closer. Sorry, it's a little hard to measure perfectly accurate here. Maybe it's like 3.5, maybe it's even 4 inches, right? So you'd pay for your 4 inches, which in that situation you couldn't even do because you'd be going through the wall, and then you're going to get your 1 inch left of movement. So the difference is from here to here, and that is a world of difference for the game. So make sure that you're paying for your movement and you're paying for your rotations, and all will be good to the world, and everyone will feel happy because we're playing the game correctly. All right. Now, another thing is this silly thing about disembarkations. So let me show you this. This is very, very silly. I see people do it all the time. So let me put a little aura around this truck. A lot of people will say, okay, cool, I'm just going to advance my knobs. So let me go ahead and roll the advance roll. And they'll say, boom, I rolled a 1. Okay. And then they get them out right here. And then they go ahead and move their models to be right up in the corner. This is nonsense. It is not fair. It is cheating because you did not know if you were going to be putting them over here, or if you were, maybe if you rolled a really high advance, you were going to try to make a charge over here into these scouts. Let's say that I rolled a 6. So we'll just turn that into a 6. Then I very well might want to disembark my knobs in front of the truck instead of on the side of it. By rolling the advance before you get them out, you give yourself the advantage of a lot of pre-knowledge. When you rolled a 1, you never would have gone for this, but when you rolled a 6, maybe you 100% wanted to go for this charge. Do you guys understand what I'm saying there? So you do not roll advances before you disembark. You disembark and then you roll an advance. Because if we say deployed right here, and then we rolled a 1 on our advance, we might get screwed because maybe our war boss won't be able to completely hide or something like that. Or if, say, I deployed him like over here and then I rolled a 1, I might not be able to get him to hide inside the ruin. He might be visible now. So you have to make the decision where you want to disembark before you roll your advance. Now, another thing. Okay, so this scenario actually came up on stream very recently where I was watching some people play. And both players were very good. They were very kind. They were very polite. But something just kind of happened, and it was a little bit wrong. Right? So essentially what they did is they charged a unit of orcs into a unit of scouts. And the intention of what they were trying to accomplish, let me see if it was more like this, actually. And so the intention of what they were trying to accomplish was they wanted to pile into the Death Company here so that they could kill the Death Company. Now, this is a legit maneuver that can work because in 10th edition, you don't actually need to charge a unit in order to attack them. You just need to be within engagement range. So if you pile in, no problem. So effectively what they did is they charged these scouts because it was a much closer charge. And since they can't end base to base with the scouts because that was impossible because the scouts are on the inside of the ruin, what he ended up doing was he ended up piling in over here to make sure that he was able to attack the Death Company. Now, theoretically, this is very, very possible, but this situation he ended in wasn't really possible because when you're ending a pile-in move, you must end your pile-in move closer to the closest enemy model. So right now, this war boss, for example, is 0.9 inches away from this scout. He's 1.3 inches away from this scout, and he is 3.1 inches away from this Death Company Marine. So on stream, what they did is they piled in this way so that they could actually fight the Death Company Marine. This is an illegal maneuver. You can't do it because even though he ends base to base over here, he's moving further away from the closest enemy model. So he effectively did this, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. And none of these were illegal moves because each time he were moving further away from the closest enemy model. Now, the intent of what he was trying to accomplish was very, very possible. But this is an example of a very, very sloppy play that in all reality just can't happen in this particular scenario. So if they wanted that scenario to occur, what they would have had to have done is end the charge, say, right here. Had they ended the charge in this position, it would have been no darn problem. This would have been fine because at this point they could just pile in right here and then pile in right here. But that is not the scenario that happened on stream, and it confused a lot of the audience. So just make sure that you're very, very clear with the way that your movements are working, that your pile-ins are working correctly, and you're going to eliminate a lot of the feel bads that could come up from scenarios such as this. Back to the PowerPoint. All right, and we are back. And the best way to basically solve all those things, guys, is just always pre-measure your movement. That's bottom line. Okay. Number 3, we have fast dice rolling. This is a very easy one and quick one. Always roll your dice clearly in front of your opponent and do not immediately pick things up. Let them see what you rolled. Very oftentimes, you'll see people rolling behind terrain and telling you what they got. I mean, that's great, but like, let me just see it. You know, I'm not, it doesn't take you anything to do it in a place where your opponent can actually see your dice. And this means that if you say roll a really amazing roll, your opponent's always just going to be able to immediately know, oh, great, that's an amazing roll. But if you roll it behind terrain and you tell them it was an amazing roll, it can create some feel bads. Let them watch your dice roll. If you're doing feel no pains, make sure you identify clearly the amount of saves that are required. Then you get to count with your opponent to make sure you both get the same number. All right. So if you have 10 saves and they each cause 2 damage and you have a 4 feel no pain, make sure you're both counting how many saves have actually been made and how many damage have been distributed. That way you're on the same page and there's no arguments being like, hey, I actually think you have 2 more saves to make, and your opponent's like, no, I made them all. It just doesn't happen. Just count together, work together to make this happen. Then last thing that you do with dice is you watch out for biased, cocked dice rollers. Set rules to avoid this. So I'll see this happen a lot of times when I'm playing with people, and whenever one of my dice looks cocked and it's a bad dice, they don't say anything. But the second one, if they roll a dice and it's like a little uneven and it's a little bit cocked, and they will immediately say it's cocked and they'll roll it again. It creates these weird situations. Just identify very strictly what a cocked dice is and what it's not. For my purposes, I always roll in a dice tray. If the dice is not in a tray, if it bounces out, I'm going to re-roll it. If a dice is not flat, I'm going to re-roll it. I will not accept anything that's not flat. Then you never have to worry about anything. There's no such thing as a cocked dice. Or if it's not flat, it's cocked. and then you just re-roll it. This creates a scenario where no one is going to be taking advantage of anyone or creating any other things. So that's very easy. Also, by the way, if you like this design here, this is the design of the up-and-coming Happy Crumpet Wargaming dice, which I am very excited and very proud to announce that we are doing in concert with the Baron of Dice, who makes the greatest high-level resin dice out there. They are square edges, which is going to be sick. I think they should be available for order in about 2 to 3 weeks, and I'm really, really pumped about it. Let's move on to the last thing, and then we'll wrap this thing up. Clock abuse. Clock abuse is a real deal, especially in a tournament setting. Listen, guys, it's very easy to not abuse a clock. The clock is there to keep a game moving. It's not there to be utilized as a weapon against your opponent. If your opponent is deploying their models and the clock is on them, do not put your models on the table. That is not okay. But that means that you will be deploying on their time. I have seen people do this. So I'm deploying, I'm trying to figure out where I want to put my Storm Boys, for example. And my opponent goes ahead and puts down a unit. So the second I say, okay, cool, my Storm Boys are here, I click it to him, they just click it right back to me, and then I have to start deploying again. So effectively what happens is they deploy on your time, not on their time. And that is abusive and is nonsense. So whenever I see opponents start to do this, what I do is I say, hey, listen, do me a favor, don't put your models on the table until I am done and I put the time back on you. And your opponent might go, oh, it doesn't matter, it saves time. It's like, no. It saves you time, but it doesn't save me time. So you can deploy on your time and I'll deploy my time. There is nothing wrong with deploying on your time and you deploying on your time. This is a totally fine and valid thing to say, and everyone's going to have no problems. If you play on your time, there's no issues. Another thing to look out for is opponents who are sticklers with the time, shall I say. So if you're rolling a save roll and they click the clock to you, make sure they click it back on themselves. I have seen some people do stuff like this where they attack me with 40 attacks and I have to make 3 saves. So I roll 3 dice and they click it over for me for my 3 dice rolls. But then they go on to their next activation and they don't put the clock back on themselves. The onus is on, if you put the clock on someone, the onus is also on you to put it back on yourself, okay? If you're going to put it on them for a 3-second interaction, you better put that shit back on yourself afterwards. Otherwise, that is BS and it is not okay. So make sure you watch out for clock pirates who are doing stuff like that. Anyway, here we go. We got to identify the difference. Cheating here is an intentional act, okay? And cheating is never to be tolerated. Sloppy play might also be an intentional act. However, this can be very, very reciprocated. So let's take that example that I was talking about, the player who did the pile-in. He just didn't do it very well. If he and his opponent had agreed that they're just playing sloppy right now and it's fine, it's okay. But that person also needs to allow his opponent to play sloppy as well. Okay, cool. If that's the scenario, if that's what you and your opponent have agreed upon, basically no issue. When you see these sloppy plays that create these little advantageous situations, but your opponent is also giving you advantageous situations, it's not cheating. It's just you guys are playing sloppy. And you know what? If you've agreed to play sloppy, no problems. Guys, listen, ignorance is always going to occur in this game. It is very, very complicated game. I get rules wrong. This is what I do for a profession. I teach Warhammer. Occasionally, I'll get rules wrong. I've played with some of the best players in the world, and these guys get rules wrong. It's complicated. There's a lot of freaking rules. So having a little bit of a mistake or playing a little sloppy every now and then is not cheating, and it's not that big a deal. It's really just scenarios where you can actually learn from it. But you need to actually learn from mistakes that you make so that you can play cleaner games in the future. Just because something does something wrong doesn't mean it's cheating. However, I want you to use the tools that we've been talking about in this video to make sure that you play better next time and that you communicate with your opponent better next time. Mistakes versus brain farts. There's a big difference between a mistake and a brain fart. So this is maybe slightly outside the scope of this video, but I'm wrapping it up here, so I just kind of want to finish up here. These things can be really tough to identify. So when I'm playing this game, I always give grace to my opponent. If my opponent moves some models and a model's outside of coherency, I don't make them take coherency checks and die. I say, hey, bro, just nudge your model. It was a little out of coherency. They didn't intend to move it out of coherency. It just happened. Things happen. It's okay. Be cool with your opponent. This can always be very, very easily rectified simply by talking your intent. And I have an entire video on speaking intent while you play. So go ahead and give that a check out. But essentially, here's the deal. If I am putting models in a certain position and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, listen, I'm hiding behind this ruin so that you can't see me. Your opponent gets to say, okay, cool. I can't see you. So then when it's their turn to come and like shoot, if you have a little spear that's sticking out, You just say, oh, let me just rotate this in. As I said, I was clearly intending to hide there, and your opponent says, yes, sir, no problem. You spoke your intent. I know that was your intention. Now, if I didn't say that and I had a spear sticking out, they should shoot me because they didn't know my intent was to be hiding from every angle line of sight. So just speak your intent. Tell your opponent what you're attempting to do so that you and your opponent can accomplish the goal together. Makes things way easier and way better. Basically, essentially, this is the last slide, guys. When you are playing with an opponent and you might think that they might be abusing some rules or just trying to like rule bully you or clock abuse you, here's the deal. All you got to do is set standards with communication. A lot of times, these people are not trying to abuse you at all. It's just how their group of friends play. So they're just playing the same way. So you just set standards with communication. This is how you handle wargaming. This is how you handle your life in general. I assume anyone out there who's married, you know that you need rules of communication. I know I certainly do with my wife, and it is a much happier life when we communicate correctly. So begin your game by identifying the level of strictness that you're going into the game with. Okay, it's very, very easy. Hey, bro, the way I play is I play by intent. So if you are moving around, just tell me what you're doing. That way, if you accidentally moved out of position, but you had told me what your intention was, we can just fix it and there's no issues. Some people out there, believe it or not, don't actually even want to banter during games. I've played games in tournaments where my opponent looks at me and they said, hey, just so you know, I just take this seriously. I don't want us to really banter. If you have questions, we can talk, but I really just kind of want to roll dice and play the game. I can actually respect that. Now, that's not really someone I want to play against, but they weren't being jerks at all. They were just being very, very clear about their intentions up front. This happened to me when I was playing at the WTC against someone. Very nice person. Afterwards, we got a beer. It was great. But they were just very, very clear that they don't want to be joking around. They're just treating this game very seriously, and they don't want to talk unless we're talking specifically about this game that we're playing. Hey, man, he communicated clearly. We had a lovely game. Certainly wasn't my favorite game just because I like to joke around, but there was no feels bads at all. Explain what playing by intent is and explain what you're willing to let slide. When I play against my opponent, what I tell them straight up is, hey, listen, I punish decisions, not knowledge. So if there's a scenario where you don't know that one of my unit has this ability, say you just don't know that they have a reactive movement and I didn't tell you that, I'm not going to punish you for that. You can go ahead and change your movement. That's totally fine. But if they know that I have a reactive movement because I very clearly just told him everything in my army and they don't ask for clarifications later, I'm going to punish them because that's a decision. That's not a knowledge mistake because I've told them the answer. All right. And then the last thing that you really need to do is you just need to make sure that you pre-measure everything. This will make life so much better. Tournaments, they're a different situation because they're always going to have written standards that you must submit to. So you might not even need to have these pre-game conversations, but I highly encourage pre-game conversations. Anyway, if you made it to the end of the video, here's a picture of a very, very cute otter. He's awesome and he's looking to crump. If you guys like this stuff, please hit the like button, subscribe, and we will catch up with you in another episode of Happy Crumpin' Wargaming. Until next time, bye.